The grey hair pulled into a tight bun. The worn scrubs 2 sizes too large. The way she refilled coffee for younger nurses without being asked. That's all Dr. Hargrove saw when he glanced at Margaret Walsh moving through the night shift at Mercy General in Houston. Just the old lady. Just background noise. He had no idea. Margaret arrived at 1900 hours, same as always. Same blue Civic in the lot. Same careful walk from the parking garage, her shoulders squared, her breathing controlled like she was moving through enemy territory instead of a hospital corridor. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead, casting that particular green shadow across linoleum floors that smelled of antiseptic and something underneath, copper, fear, the ghost of 1,000 midnight crises. She clocked in without speaking to anyone, pulled on her badge, and made her way to the cardiac floor where 3 nurses were already drowning in admissions. "Margaret's here," one of them said. Relief in her voice. Margaret didn't respond. She moved through the ward like smoke, checking vitals on the monitors, her hand steady as she adjusted for drips on a post-op patient in bed 7. Her fingers moved with surgical precision, the kind of precision that came not from nursing school but from a different kind of training, the kind that taught you how to work in the dark with people's lives falling apart in front of you. She'd been the night shift anchor at Mercy General for 3 years now. 3 years of keeping her head down. 3 years of perfect charting. 3 years of hands that knew too much. She talked a panicked resident named Chen through an intubation on bed 4. The kid was sweating through his white coat, his voice climbing an octave as he fumbled with the laryngoscope. Margaret stood beside him, her voice so low the monitors almost drowned her out. "Blade in. See the vocal cords? I can't quite. You're in. Now tube." Slowly. Chen threaded the endotracheal tube with Margaret's hand steady on his shoulder. The tube went down. The capnograph confirmed placement. Color changed on the monitor. Sinus rhythm. The kid stepped back, shaking. "You got it," Margaret said. She didn't stay to watch his relief. She was already moving to the next bed, the next crisis, the next person who needed her to be someone they could trust. Every medication she reconciled was reconciled to the decimal point. Every procedure she documented was documented exactly as it happened, no embellishment, no creative billing, no 5 minutes of work coded as 20. In the break room at 0200 hours, Margaret sat alone in a metal chair that screeched when she moved. The vending machine hummed in the corner, that low electrical buzz that meant nothing to anyone else. She reached inside her jacket, through the worn navy scrubs, and found the patch sewn into the lining. Faded. Fraying at the edges. Naval Special Warfare Group, the letters barely visible anymore after 20 years of being hidden. She pressed her fingers against it through the fabric, a ritual she performed every shift. A reminder. A weight. A thing that meant something to people she would probably never see again. Footsteps. She pulled her hand back. Dr. Hargrove entered like he owned the room, Italian shoes clicking against the tile, the kind of shoes that cost more than Margaret's weekly rent. His tie was already loosened, his expression somewhere between boredom and satisfaction. He was checking his phone, his eye scanning something on the screen, and whatever he saw made his mouth curve into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He had a message from someone named Pierce on the hospital board, confirming that another billing cycle had cleared. 14,000 in upcoded procedures for the week. Beautiful work, the message said. Keep it up. He didn't look at Margaret. But if he had, he would have missed it anyway. What Dr. Hargrove saw, an aging night nurse in faded scrubs, grey hair in a bun, hands that showed the liver spots of someone who'd been in healthcare too long. Someone who'd chosen to stay a floor nurse instead of getting her practitioner's license. Someone without ambition. Someone background. What he didn't see, the scar tissue on her knuckles from rappelling rope burns. The muscle memory that made her check exit routes in every room, 2 doors out of the break room, nurse station has a back corridor, stairwell to the south. The way her eyes tracked movement, the way her body positioned itself to be a barrier between threats and vulnerable people. The way she developed calluses on her palms not from charting but from carrying combat litters through fire. The way her breathing never changed, even during code blues when other nurses' hearts were hammering against their ribs. He didn't see the unit patch hidden in her jacket lining. 3 years. That's how long Margaret had been documenting everything perfectly at Mercy General. 3 years of charting that was more accurate than any electronic medical record could possibly be. 3 years of catching medication errors before they became catastrophes, flagging procedures that didn't match the documentation, creating a paper trail so clean and so detailed that if anyone ever decided to audit Dr. Hargrove's billing codes, the discrepancies would be undeniable. And that terrified him. Margaret's meticulous charting meant that when he upcoded a simple suture job as a complex laceration repair, her notes said suture job. When he billed for an MRI that was never ordered, her intake document showed no such order. When he documented procedures that never happened, charging insurance companies thousands for phantom work, her careful handwriting, the handwriting of someone trained to document wartime medical decisions for military judges, created a permanent record of the truth. The problem was that Dr. Hargrove didn't know any of this yet. Not consciously. He just knew that something about Margaret made him uneasy. That grey hair. That quiet. That way she moved like she'd seen worse things than a hospital could offer. It wasn't until the following Tuesday that he turned his unease into strategy. He stood in the nurses' station at 0300 hours, when the shift was quiet and most of the night staff had gathered for their brief break. Margaret was at the far end, checking labs on her tablet, her presence so unobtrusive that most people forgot she was there. Dr. Hargrove cleared his throat. The gesture was calculated, a man making sure he had an audience. "I've got a bet for everyone," he announced, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone used to being listened to. "I'll buy coffee for a week, anyone's choice, good stuff from that place on Main Street, to whoever can predict when Margaret here finally decides to retire." He smiled when he said it. Not unkind. Just the casual dismissal of someone who'd already decided what someone else was worth. "My money says the old lady quits within a week." The room didn't explode. Nobody called him out. That was the thing about institutional power in hospitals, it moved like water, impossible to grab, always flowing away from the powerless. One of the younger nurses laughed nervously. Chen looked at his shoes. And Margaret, who had survived a lot of worse conversations than this in a lot worse places, simply turned the page on her tablet and kept reading. But Dr. Hargrove saw it. For just a fraction of a second, her jaw tightened. One breath, carefully controlled. And then it was gone. She was background again. He'd already won. What he didn't know was that Margaret had won too. Not in the way that mattered to him, she wasn't going to quit, and he'd be proven wrong in a week. She'd won something far more valuable, she'd confirmed what his actions meant. He wasn't just being a jerk. He was scared. He was creating a social campaign to push her out because her perfect charting was threatening something. And a threatened man, Margaret had learned long ago in a place called Helmand Province, was a man who would eventually make a mistake. A decade and a half earlier, Margaret had knelt in the dirt outside a forward operating base in Helmand, her hands dark with blood that wasn't hers. Around her, the medical tent was controlled chaos, fours running, monitors beeping their urgent language, the smell of iodine and copper so thick you could taste it. A young soldier was on the table in front of her, shrapnel embedded in his abdomen, his blood pressure dropping like a stone. His name was Clayton. He was 19 years old. He had a tattoo of his mother's initials on his left shoulder. Margaret's hands moved. No hesitation. No second guessing. A 14-gauge needle went into his abdomen, her fingers finding the landmarks by touch as much as by sight. The peritoneal lavage came back positive. Internal bleeding. She'd made the call before the doctor even arrived. By the time the surgical team could get him prepped, she'd already started massive transfusion protocol, 2 units whole blood from the cooler, calculating blood loss rates in her head like it was simple arithmetic. Pain was information. Every drop of blood was data. Every vital sign was a story her hands could read before anyone else even knew the patient was dying. Clayton lived. He'd gone on to become a SEAL commander. And Margaret had walked out of Helmand Province officially dead, her record scrubbed, her identity buried under layers of classified redaction, ordered to disappear after a Black Ops extraction that went sideways in 2003. She was supposed to be a ghost. Instead, she was here, in a Houston hospital at 0300 hours, charting with perfect accuracy while a man who'd committed fraud in his shoes thought he'd scared an old woman into quitting. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next changed everything. The next morning, Dr. Hargrove stood in the nurses' station during shift change, 30 staff members crowding around for assignments. He pointed at Margaret with his coffee cup, the gesture casual, almost lazy, but his eyes burned with calculation. "I'm making a public prediction," he announced, his voice carrying across the space like a blade. "The old lady quits within a week. She's slow, she's outdated, and frankly, I'm shocked she can still read a chart without bifocals." Laughter rippled through the younger nurses, nervous, uncertain laughter that wanted permission from someone older to feel genuine. Margaret stood at the far end of the station, alphabetizing discharge papers with the same deliberate care she brought to everything. She took one measured breath, her spine straight, and met his eyes. "I've outlasted overconfident men before, Doctor." One tear escaped down her left cheek without warning, as if her body had decided to betray her composure. But she wiped it away without flinching, without breaking eye contact, and the gesture transformed the moment entirely. Hargrove's smile faltered for just a second before he turned away, muttering something about getting back to rounds. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the nurses dispersed, conversations resuming, but something had shifted in the air, a current of respect for the woman who had faced public humiliation without cracking. 3 days later, Margaret carried her lunch tray through the crowded cafeteria at 11:36 a.m., meatloaf and green beans on the ceramic plate, black coffee steaming in a styrofoam cup. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical song above rows of tables where staff ate in clusters. She was thinking about her daughter Emma, about the unit patch hidden in her jacket pocket, when Hargrove's shoulder slammed into hers from behind with the force of a deliberate collision. The tray flew from her hands, crashing to the tile floor with a sound like breaking glass. Food splattering across her scrubs and the white floor, coffee spreading in a dark pool. The entire cafeteria went silent. 50 faces turned toward them. "Oh, sorry, Grandma," Hargrove said loudly, his voice dripping with false concern. "Didn't see you there. Maybe you should stick to the kiddie table where you can reach." He stepped over the spilled lunch without pausing, without offering his hand, and walked toward the exit as if the moment meant nothing. Margaret knelt slowly, her spine protesting with sharp pain that she'd learned to metabolize into data rather than suffering. She picked up the tray with hands that didn't shake. The kitchen staff emerged with towels, but she waved them away. "I've got it," she said quietly. She stood, looked Hargrove in the eye as he lingered at the cafeteria door, and said with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse, "Dignity isn't something you can knock to the floor, Doctor." Her voice was soft, but it carried. A young resident named Chen actually applauded, a single clap that he stopped himself mid-motion, embarrassed. Margaret didn't acknowledge it. She simply cleaned the floor, discarded the tray, and walked back to the unit with coffee stains down her scrubs that she didn't bother to change. Hargrove's jaw clenched hard enough that his molars ached. This wasn't working. The public humiliation that should have broken her was instead building her into something resilient, something the staff was beginning to respect. He needed to escalate. Not harder, smarter. He needed to end this before her meticulous charting revealed the full extent of what he'd been doing, upcoding procedures, billing for equipment never used, charging for specialist consultations that never happened. Margaret's documentation was a threat not just to his career but potentially to his freedom. The margin audit was scheduled for 3 weeks out. He had 18 days. The following week, Hargrove cornered her at the 4th-floor nursing station during evening rounds, when the hallway was empty except for a medication cart and the hiss of the ceiling ventilation system. He'd been waiting for her, watching her pattern. Margaret emerged from patient room 407 with her charting tablet, her back to him, her attention forward. Hargrove stepped directly into her path and threw a patient chart at her feet. The papers scattered across the floor like wounded birds. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he sneered, his voice taking on the tone of someone speaking to a servant. "That's about all you're good for anymore. File clerk." Yoni, he stopped himself, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. Margaret took one measured breath. A single tear traced down her cheek as she maintained eye contact with him, her eyes the color of winter water. She wiped it away without flinching, her movement precise and controlled, the gesture of a woman who had cried in combat and learned to keep fighting anyway. "I've been dismissed by better men than you, Doctor," she said quietly, each word deliberate and clear, "and I'm still standing." Then she knelt and picked up the chart. Hargrove's face flushed crimson. The rage that rose in him was different from embarrassment, it was the pure fury of a man watching his leverage evaporate. In that moment, he made the calculation that would ultimately destroy him, he would accelerate everything. No more subtle escalation. No more waiting for the audit. He would manufacture the evidence he needed, activate every favor owed to him, and remove Margaret Walsh from Mercy General within 48 hours. He returned to his office and closed the door. His hands moved across the keyboard with the precision of someone who had constructed lies before. First call, board member Carlson, who owed him for burying a malpractice suit 3 years prior, a case involving a patient who'd suffered permanent spinal damage due to Hargrove's negligence. The favor had cost Carlson $847,000 in a quiet settlement. "I need a termination approved," Hargrove said without preamble. "No questions. Hostile work environment. Insubordination. I'll have the paperwork." Second call, Margaret sparse references from a temp agency in Austin, where he planted seeds about boundary issues with patients and possible cognitive decline and erratic behavior. The temp agency supervisor knew him socially and didn't ask many questions. Third call, an outside investigator from a consulting firm that specialized in manufacturing HR violations for hospital clients who needed legal cover for terminations. "I need documentation that she's unstable, insubordinate, anything that sticks." The investigator quoted $4,200 for a fabricated report. Hargrove authorized it immediately. He hung up the phone and sat back in his chair, which wheezed like a wounded animal under his weight. His fingers drummed against the mahogany desk, a nervous habit that betrayed the calculation underneath. He pulled Margaret's personnel file from the cabinet, studying it with growing frustration. Her records were thin, almost suspiciously so, with a 5-year gap in employment history that no one had questioned during hiring. No social media, no military service documentation, just a nursing license from a Texas board and a P.O. box address in Pearland. Something was wrong with her paper trail, but he didn't have time to figure out what. The gaps in her history should have raised flags during onboarding, but somehow they hadn't. That itself was strange. Classified redaction rarely appeared in civilian employment files, and yet her file had the unmistakable texture of information that had been deliberately removed. But Hargrove didn't understand what he was seeing. He only knew that Margaret Walsh had to disappear from Mercy General before the quarterly billing audit in 3 weeks, before her perfect records became evidence that could end him. That night, Margaret drove home through Houston's South Side, past neighborhoods where oil refineries glowed orange against the dark sky like distant fires. She thought about the cafeteria, about Hargrove's escalating desperation, about the way his rage had become unfocused, dangerous in the way of cornered animals. She knew the signs because she'd seen them 20 years ago in Helmand Province, in the faces of men who realized they were going to lose. She pulled into her driveway at 10:58 p.m. and found her daughter Emma still awake, doing homework at the kitchen table under the overhead light. "Mom, why are you home late?" Emma asked, not looking up from her algebra. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She moved to her bedroom and pulled the faded unit patch from her jacket lining, SEAL Team 3 insignia, worn from years of being sewn against her ribs. The embroidery was nearly gone, the stitching unraveling at the edges. She stared at it for a long moment, this tiny piece of cloth that connected her to a version of herself that didn't officially exist anymore. "Just a reminder, baby," Margaret said finally, tucking it back into the jacket. Of who I used to be. She didn't tell Emma about the classified operation in Helmand Province in 2003, the extraction that went sideways. She didn't explain that Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Keating had been ordered to disappear, her record scrubbed at the Pentagon level, her identity buried under layers of classified redaction, reborn as Margaret Walsh with a social security number that was only 15 years old. She didn't mention the 3 enemy combatants she'd spared against direct orders because they were teenagers, unarmed, crying. She didn't explain that the disappearance was supposed to be permanent, that she was never supposed to surface, never supposed to matter, never supposed to be anything more than a ghost in a borrowed life. The next morning, a young Navy SEAL commander named Jackson Reeves was wheeled through Mercy General's ambulance bay at 6:32 a.m., his breathing labored and shallow, his oxygen saturation dropping with each shallow chest rise. The paramedics called out vitals as they moved. Commander's been experiencing chest pain and shortness of breath for 2 hours, worsening in the last 30 minutes. Breath sounds absent on the left. We suspect pneumothorax. Margaret was assigned to triage, and the moment she saw his face, older, harder, carved from different experiences, her hands froze for exactly 1 second. She recognized the pattern of burns on his left shoulder, the specific constellation of shrapnel scars on his neck. She had pulled him from a burning vehicle in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, 21 years ago when he was a 7-year-old boy, the son of an Afghan interpreter named Rashid who'd been caught in crossfire, the child she'd carried 3 miles through enemy territory to the nearest combat medic, his small body bleeding into her uniform, his voice asking if he was going to die. That was the moment when everything changed, though Margaret didn't know it yet. The stretcher wheeled through the automatic doors at 11:27 p.m., and Margaret knew before she even saw the patient's face. The paramedics were calling out vitals like a funeral march, blood pressure dropping, oxygen saturation in free fall, respirations labored and shallow. The patient was young, military-bearing even in crisis, his muscled frame rigid against the gurney as he fought for each breath. The emergency room erupted into controlled chaos. Nurses scattered to crash cart stations. Residents materialized from the back corridors. Dr. Hargrove emerged from his office, already pulling on gloves with the confidence of a man who'd never met a patient problem he couldn't solve through sheer institutional authority. Margaret was finishing a chart at the triage desk when the paramedic report reached her ears. Pneumothorax. Possibly tension. Breath sounds absent on the right side. The description carved itself into her muscle memory like a blade. She stood without thinking. Movement toward the trauma bay came as naturally as breathing. The night shift supervisor caught her arm. "You're floor nursing, Margaret." "That's us code." But Margaret was already moving, her feet carrying her down the hallway before her conscious mind caught up. She couldn't explain why. There was no logical reason for a night shift floor nurse to push into a trauma bay that didn't belong to her, no protocol that would excuse the violation. But there was a quality to that patient's breathing, the particular wheeze of a man whose lung was collapsing against his chest cavity, that made every nerve ending in her body scream recognition. The trauma bay doors slid open. Margaret's eyes found the gurney. The patient was barely conscious, his head turned to one side, lips already taking on the waxy blue of oxygen deprivation. His hospital gown had been torn open to expose his chest, and there, on his left shoulder, was a scar. Not a surgical scar. A wound scar. A burn scar shaped like the outline of a twisted metal frame, exactly the way shrapnel leaves its signature when it's been driven through skin by an explosion in a burning vehicle. Margaret had seen that scar pattern only once before, 21 years ago, when she'd pulled a screaming 7-year-old boy from the wreckage of a Toyota pickup that had been incinerated by an IED in the Sanjin Valley. That boy had grown up. He'd become a SEAL commander. "Step back," Dr. Hargrove's voice cut through the medical machinery like a scalpel. He was positioning himself at the patient's head, fingers already reaching for an endotracheal tube, the wrong choice, the catastrophically wrong choice. "This is ER. Get out." Margaret should have left. Protocol demanded it. Hierarchy demanded it. Self-preservation demanded it. But she saw the commander's eyes rolling back, his body already shutting down from hypoxia, and something deeper than protocol took hold. The commander's name came back to her in that instant, Nathan Reeves, though she'd never known his last name back then, only that his father was an interpreter and his mother had been killed in a marketplace bombing 4 years before the vehicle fire. He'd been so small. His small hands gripping her collar as she'd carried him through enemy territory, 3 miles to the nearest Phi base, his body bleeding into her uniform. Dr. Hargrove was drawing up sedation. Completely wrong. The patient didn't need sedation, he needed air. He needed the pressure in his chest cavity released before it crushed his heart. Every second Hargrove wasted was a second the pneumothorax had to expand, to compress the left lung, to push the mediastinum toward cardiac tamponade. Margaret's hands moved before her mind could question the consequences. She'd stopped asking permission for actions that meant the difference between life and death a very long time ago. She pulled a 14-gauge needle from the crash cart, large bore, exactly what was needed for a tension pneumothorax decompression. The motion drew attention. 2 nurses looked up. A resident's eyes narrowed. Dr. Hargrove turned toward her, his face already arranging itself into the expression he perfected over the past week, the expression that said *, you're nothing, you're in the way, you don't belong here, *. What are you doing? His voice carried the kind of authority that had always come easily to men who'd never had to earn it in places where authority had to be won at gunpoint. Step back. That's an order. Margaret had received orders from sergeants and colonels, from men whose call signs she still carried in her muscle memory like talismans against forgetting. She had followed those orders in dust storms and through ambushes and into situations where hesitation meant death. But she had also been trained to recognize the moment when protocol became lethal, when hierarchy became a corpse waiting to happen. That moment was now. She moved past Hargrove, not aggressively, not with confrontation, but with the simple fluid precision of someone who had already made her decision and was merely executing it. Her left hand located the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line, fingers moving across the commander's ribs with the certainty of someone who'd performed this procedure on rubble-trapped soldiers in firefights. Her right hand drove the needle through skin and muscle, between the ribs, into the pleural space with the kind of confident motion that makes the difference between technique and desperation. The hiss came immediately, a sound like air escaping from a tire, the beautiful sound of pressure releasing, of tension transforming into relief. The commander's chest suddenly expanded fully, his rib cage rising as if he'd taken his first real breath in minutes. His oxygen saturation jumped on the monitor, 78 to 85 to 92, the numbers climbing like a lifeline being thrown to a drowning man. His eyes cleared. The waxy blue faded from his lips. His hand stopped clawing at the gurney. Dr. Hargrove's face underwent a complete transformation. The authority drained from it like water from a punctured balloon. For one crystalline moment, he looked like a man watching his entire carefully constructed world come apart. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "What the hell do you?" he started, but the code team was already flooding in, responding to the trauma alert that had been called minutes before. They saw the needle decompression, saw the patient stabilizing, saw the vital signs improving. They converted the needle to a chest tube with the efficient choreography of people trained to save lives when the moment required it. The commander's breathing steadied. The monitor showed sinus rhythm, strong and steady. The patient was going to live. Dr. Hargrove turned away from the gurney, away from Margaret, away from the commander, away from the evidence of his own medical failure. His jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscle working beneath his skin. His hands balled into fists at his sides. When he finally looked back at Margaret, his eyes carried something she'd seen before in the eyes of men who'd just realized they'd underestimated someone catastrophically. It was rage, but it was also something worse. It was calculation. He was already recalculating, already planning the next move, already reaching for the phone he kept in his white coat pocket with the kind of muscle memory that said *, I still have power, I still have leverage, I still have friends. Margaret stepped back from the gurney, her work finished. She didn't acknowledge Hargrove. She didn't claim credit for what she'd done. She simply turned and walked out of the trauma bay with the same quiet dignity she carried into everything, the same quiet dignity that had kept her invisible for 21 years, that had allowed her to wear scrubs instead of dress blues, that had permitted her to save lives without anyone asking how she knew Star. Behind her, as she reached the doors, she heard one of the residents say something to the others. It was quiet, but it carried. That's not even an ER nurse. Hargrove's face went white. Not the pale of shock, but the purple white of rage constricted through gritted teeth. The code team burst through the trauma bay doors. 3 nurses, a respiratory therapist, a cardiologist, and Margaret stepped back from Commander Reeves's bedside with the same measured composure she'd shown in every other crisis. The commander's oxygen saturation climbed. 91. 94. 97. Sinus rhythm on the monitor. Steady. Strong. The kind of recovery that shouldn't have been possible if Hargrove's fumbling had continued for another 60 seconds. Hargrove watched from the corner, his jaw working soundlessly. Margaret didn't look at him. She never did. She simply documented what she'd done in the chart: needle decompression, left anterior thoracic wall, second intercostal space, with the same clinical precision that had been threatening his entire operation for 3 months. Every line she wrote was a record. Every notation was a timestamp he couldn't erase. Within the hour, Hargrove locked his office door and made the first call. His hands trembled as he dialed board member Carlson. Not from fear. From calculation. She performed an invasive procedure without authorization, Hargrove said, his voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone of a man calling in debts. Needle decompression. Technically a chest tube procedure. I have 6 witnesses. This is our termination cause. Patient endangerment. Insubordination. Clear violation of scope of practice. He paused. Let the silence work. You remember that malpractice complaint from 2019? The one that disappeared from state records? I kept it from becoming a civil case. I think it's time you remembered that. Carlson said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, I'll make the calls. The second call went to board member Pierce, who'd been caught billing for surgeries that never happened on Hargrove's recommendation. The third went to board member Hayes, whose daughter had gotten preferential scheduling at Mercy General's fertility clinic after Hargrove's recommendation to HR. All 3 owed him. All 3 understood what happened when debts came due. The fourth call was to the outside investigator Hargrove had already hired. Accelerate the audit report, he said. I need it today. Not next week. Make it focus on her patient interactions. Look for boundary violations. Patient endangerment. Any deviation from protocol. He hung up before the investigator could ask questions. He'd already paid him $12,000. The man would deliver what he was hired to deliver. Then Hargrove did something that later, much later, would be his fatal mistake. He accessed Margaret's digital personnel file and began adding entries. His fingers moved across his keyboard like a musician playing from muscle memory, each keystroke deliberate, cold. Verbal warning for medication error, 7/15. Written warning for patient complaint, 8/20 seconds. Final warning for insubordination, 9/10. He backdated them 3 months, creating a pattern that looked institutional, supported, documented. A paper trail that justified immediate termination without question. The timestamps showed his administrative user ID and password with each entry. Every access logged. Every change recorded. The problem was that he didn't know the FBI had been monitoring Mercy General's billing system since March. 6 months of surveillance. 6 forensic accountants tracking insurance fraud across 312 patient records. And one of those accountants had flagged every unauthorized access to personnel files as potentially relevant to constructing a case of coordinated misconduct, the kind of conspiracy that moved federal charges from civil fraud to RICO charges. Every keystroke Hargrove made was captured in triplicate. Timestamp. Credentials. Computer. IP address. Mouse movements. Everything. By end of shift, the machinery of his destruction was already in motion, and he had no idea. 2 security guards appeared at the nurse's station where Margaret was finishing her documentation on Commander Reeves's transfer to ICU. His vital signs had stabilized. His breathing was strong. His O2 sat holding at 98%. "Ms. Walsh, please come with us," the taller guard said. His voice was neutral. Professional. The kind of neutral that meant he'd been instructed not to make eye contact. Margaret closed her chart and stood. The station went quiet. 37 staff members watched as she walked past them, her movement steady, her face composed. She didn't slow down. Didn't acknowledge anyone. Didn't let them see anything except what she wanted them to see, a woman walking toward an uncertain outcome with the same equanimity she'd shown while performing emergency surgery with her bare hands and a field knife in a ditch in Helmand. The guards escorted her down 3 floors to human resources. The elevator hummed its mechanical descent. The walls pressed in like the sides of a tomb. When the doors opened on the 2nd floor, a woman named Patricia was waiting with a file folder and the practiced expression of someone who'd done this 100 times. "Please sit, Margaret," Patricia said. Margaret Saturday. The termination letter was written in the particular language of institutional cowardice, unauthorized invasive medical procedure, failure to follow chain of command, pattern of disciplinary issues, effective immediately. The letter cited 6 months of infractions that didn't exist. Margaret read it twice, her hand steady, her eyes absorbing every word. Then she set it on the desk and said nothing. "Do you have anything you'd like to say?" Patricia asked. It was the box she needed to check. Margaret looked at her. "No," she said. She couldn't defend herself. She couldn't explain that the pattern of disciplinary issues was fabricated. She couldn't tell them that she was a decorated senior chief petty officer who'd performed needle decompression 73 times in combat conditions in Helmand Province, in a surgical tent with nothing but a headlamp and her hand steady as a laser. She couldn't say that her military records existed, classified, redacted, buried under 6 layers of federal security clearance. Officially, that version of her didn't exist. Margaret Keating, combat medic, didn't appear in any public database. Margaret Walsh, night shift nurse, was all that remained. Security walked her to her locker in the staff room. She changed out of her scrubs, pulled on her jacket, the one with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the one she'd worn for 20 years, the one that meant nothing to anyone who looked at it, and signed out at the desk. The clock read for 56 p.m. She'd been escorted from Mercy General without incident. Without ceremony. Without anyone saying her name. The drive home took 16 minutes. She sat at a red light on Main Street and didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She didn't press her forehead against the steering wheel and brake. That would come later. That came only in private, only when the mask could finally drop. She arrived at the house at 5:03 p.m. It was a small bungalow in the Montrose district, 48 square meters, white trim, a porch where she'd sat with her daughter Emma every evening for the past 12 years. She made tea and sat at the kitchen table because she couldn't think of anywhere else to be. The house was too quiet. The afternoon light was dying. Her phone sat on the table, turned off, powered down, dead weight in her pocket. At 3:15 p.m. the next day, Emma's usual after-school time, the front door opened. Footsteps. A backpack hitting the floor. The sound of a child who'd had a normal day, completely unaware that the world had shifted on its axis. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, her uniform disheveled, her hair falling out of its bun, completely unprepared for what she saw, her mother still in yesterday's scrubs, hands wrapped around a cold mug of tea, tears tracking silently down her face in the daylight that no longer had any mercy in it. "Mom," Emma said. Her voice went up at the end, turned into a question. "Why are you home early?" Margaret looked at her daughter, this child she'd raised alone, this child who had no idea who her mother actually was, this child who thought her mother was just a tired nurse who worked nights and came home smelling like disinfectant and human suffering, and found that she had no words. She'd survived 3 combat tours. She'd carried wounded men through minefields with rounds snapping past her head. She'd performed surgery in mud with improvised tools. She'd looked death in the eye 17 times and walked backward, steadily, never breaking stride. But explaining to her 12-year-old daughter why someone had thrown away her second chance at a normal life, why the system had turned on her for saving a man's life, why the mask she'd worn for 2 decades had finally cracked, that broke something inside her that enemy fire never had. Emma crossed the kitchen and hugged her mother. Margaret held her, still saying nothing, and the silence in the house was the kind of silence that precedes everything. The phone rang at 6:06 a.m. Margaret stared at it through 3 rings before answering. The hospital administrator's voice came through tight with urgency. "Ms. Walsh, we need you back immediately. Something's happened. A patient arrived overnight, a former Taliban fighter, seeking asylum. He's asking for you specifically." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "For me?" "Administrator, I was terminated yesterday." "I know. Just, please come. Bring identification." The line went dead. She dressed in silence, muscle memory guiding her hands through button loops and zipper pulls. The faded unit patch remained where it always was, sewn into the lining of her jacket, a piece of history she'd hidden inside itself for 20 years, waiting for a day that might never come. Emma was still asleep. Margaret left a note on the kitchen counter and drove toward Mercy General through pre-dawn Houston traffic, her hand steady on the wheel, her mind running through protocols and contingencies the way it always did. The ER entrance looked different in daylight. Softer, somehow. More human. The security guard, the same one who'd escorted her out yesterday, nodded as she passed, confusion crossing his face. Margaret walked through the automatic doors and heard it immediately. Voices. Dozens of them. The entire hospital appeared to have gathered in the main lobby, a crowd that stretched from the reception desk to the back corridor, staff members standing shoulder to shoulder in silence. At the center, standing at a microphone that hadn't been there yesterday, was Commander Nathan Reeves. The young SEAL with the scar on his shoulder. The boy she'd pulled from a burning vehicle when he was 7 years old. His dress uniform was immaculate, white so white they seemed to generate their own light, ribbons arranged in precise rows across his chest, his bearing the kind of stillness that comes from having held human lives in the balance. "I want to tell you about the person in this room," Reeves said, his voice carrying the weight of command authority. "I want to tell you who she really is." His eyes found Margaret's across the crowd. "This woman holds the rank of Senior Chief Petty Officer in the United States Navy." The crowd shifted. Breathed. Margaret felt rather than heard the shock ripple through the lobby like a shock wave traveling through water. A trembling nurse, the same one who'd always brought Margaret coffee during night shifts, stepped forward holding a folder, its edges marked with the distinctive red tabs of classified declassification. The nurse's voice shook as she read, Naval Special Warfare Group. Embedded Combat Medic. 3 combat tours. Service record spanning 23 years and 7 months. The nurse looked up, tears streaming. 23 years. And we called you just a nurse. A grizzled SEAL team leader emerged from the crowd wearing dress whites, his face weathered like driftwood. When he spoke, his voice cracked with the kind of emotion that only comes from men who've bled with the person they're honoring. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Keating saved my life in 2003. She saved 16 lives in a single engagement in Helmand Province while taking shrapnel to her spine. He paused, his jaw working. For that action, she earned the Navy Cross for Valor Under Fire. The crowd went utterly silent. Sound seemed to have been sucked from the room, replaced only by the distant hum of the hospital's ventilation system. She also received 2 Bronze Stars with V device for Valor. 2 Purple Hearts. She's one of the most decorated combat medics in SEAL team history. Then came the doors. 2 FBI agents moving through the crowd with the precision of people who'd done this 100 times before. Margaret watched them approach the ER director's office, where Dr. Hargrove had already begun to understand. His face visible through the glass partition. His hand on his desk. His expression shifting from confusion to horror in the space of 3 seconds. "Dr. Hargrove," the lead agent said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're under arrest for wire fraud, healthcare fraud, and obstruction of justice." The handcuffs looked like they were made of silver light. Hargrove's wrists seemed impossibly small inside them. "This is insane," he spat, his voice a thing of fury and panic. "I'm the director of this ER. This is a setup. That woman performed and authorized. Your systematic upcoding cost Medicare $2.3 million over 3 years," the agent interrupted. The room had transformed into something ceremonial, something that felt less like a perp walk and more like a reckoning. "But what really interested us was your activity yesterday. At 1847 hours, you accessed Margaret Walsh's personnel file and created for backdated disciplinary entries. You altered official records to justify terminating a witness." Hargrove's face went from red to white to something beyond color, something the human face wasn't designed to express. "Those entries were. I was correcting." His voice had become the voice of something small and desperate, a thing without power, a thing without protection. "Metadata doesn't lie, Doctor. Every keystroke is logged with timestamp and IP address. The digital trail leads directly to your office computer. Your termination of Ms. Walsh occurred 17 minutes after you created those fraudulent records. We have the proof on this tablet, and we have 17 witnesses in this building who can testify to your pattern of intimidation and harassment." The crowd parted as the agents walked Hargrove toward the exit, a gauntlet of silent staff members who'd once feared him. A nurse he'd called sweetheart for 3 years turned her back. A resident he'd reduced to tears simply stared. The hospital administrator stepped forward, her voice official and final. "Dr. Hargrove, your medical license is suspended effective immediately, pending criminal trial. The board has voted unanimously to terminate your employment and refer your case to the state medical board." The elevator doors closed on his face. Margaret watched them seal shut like a door closing on an entire version of the world that no longer existed. In the lobby, Margaret stood with the faded unit patch finally visible on her jacket, that piece of history that had lived in hiding for 2 decades, stitched into the lining like a secret prayer. The patch showed a faded eagle and anchor, worn smooth by the weight of time and concealment. In the fluorescent hospital light, it seemed to glow with something beyond reflection. Around her, the staff members who'd watched Dr. Hargrove humiliate her now stood at attention, not because they were military, but because something in Margaret's presence had shifted. She'd stopped being invisible. The hospital administrator approached with stammering apologies and offers of reinstatement that Margaret barely heard. Her eyes were on Commander Reeves, who approached with his hand extended. When they shook, his grip was careful, the grip of a man who understood the weight of invisible service, the cost of survival, the strange burden of finally being seen. "I need some coffee," Margaret said quietly, the first word she'd spoken since entering the building. Someone laughed, a real laugh, the kind that breaks tension and restores the world to its proper dimensions. Several people laughed. The sound of survival. The sound of rightness being restored. 6 months later, Margaret returned to Mercy General as the new Director of Clinical Standards. Dr. Hargrove's trial had lasted 3 weeks, resulting in conviction on 14 counts. His sentence, 4 years federal prison, $2.3 million in restitution, permanent revocation of his medical license. After release, community college CPR instruction for minimum wage, a future as invisible as Margaret had been forced to be, except Hargrove would spend every moment knowing what he'd lost. Margaret stood in the main lobby, now holding a position of authority that felt like coming home. The unit patch hung framed on the wall alongside her Navy Cross citation and a plaque reading, Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Keating, USN, Honor, Courage, Commitment. Emma stood beside her in a Navy Junior ROTC uniform, finally understanding why her mother had always checked exit routes, why her hands never shook, why she'd hidden that patch for so long. That evening, Margaret stood in her new office, looking at the unit patch on the wall, and said aloud to her reflection, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." Then she turned off the lights and went home to her daughter, and never had to hide again. If this story resonated with you, if you know someone whose strength has been invisible, whose sacrifice has gone unseen, please subscribe, like, and let us know in the comments. What would you do if the world finally saw who you really were?